to the Sense of Hope podcast with One Life. I'm your host, Helen Diveston, and today we have Professor Julia Rucklidge. Julia is a Canadian-born clinical psychologist who is the director of Te Puna Toi Ora, the Mental Health and Nutrition Research Lab at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand. Julia's early work focused on psychological and neurocognitive functioning in attention deficit hyperactivity disorder in both children and adults. Today, Julia is more widely known for her research on mental health and nutrition. She became interested in the impact of micronutrients on mental health after hearing about Canadian families who were using nutrients to treat their children with bipolar disorder. Her work from Te Puna Toi Ora has explored the impact of nutritional interventions on ADHD in children and adults, anxiety and stress in adults and children following the Christchurch earthquakes, insomnia, premenstrual syndrome, depression, addictions, and emotional dysregulation. We can also add to that, I believe, prenatal depression, given the latest research that's come out. In 2015, Julia was a recipient of the Ballon Award, recognises significant contributions to the development and enhancement of clinical psychology in New Zealand. She was also named one of the most influential women in New Zealand in 2015, 2018 and 2021. Julia was awarded the Toronto French School Alumni of Distinction Award in 2017. In 2018, she received a Brave Heart Award, recognising her courage, innovation and effort to improve the lives of people in her community. And in September this year, Julia received the Innovation Medal, which recognises excellence in the proactive transformation of academic knowledge and ideas, leading to their adoption by the wider community. Thank you, Julia. Thank you for being here today and giving me your precious time, because I know you are super busy. And I also know that we'll have loads to talk about. So I'll try and keep this within around about an hour.
Okay, sounds good. And thanks for inviting me, Helen. I'm glad I could. This is a great time. I'm done with where I have no creative juice left. So
Perfect.
Perfect.
I'll take the best out of you as we go today, if there's anything left. It's so the first thing I really want to discuss and get into was you've done a load of research, and I'm really keen to hear about what you've researched and what the outcomes are. And I know that that's a lot, but if we can even just look at some of the most, the studies that I love, for example, the ones on PTSD, which I think were fantastic, the prenatal depression studies, what the outcomes were, and what the impact you think that this may have on people with mental health disorders.
Sure. Well, I mean, I actually say those are my favorite as well. Nutrimum is the most recent one. Is really such a wonderful collection, in fact, of papers that have been done on the treatment of symptoms of antenatal depression. And so that really is, at the moment, my favorite thing, because it has such wonderful implications for trying to change the start of life. And so it's really making sure that those infants are set off more resilient than I think they normally would be. So I'm really, really thrilled about it, and really do hope that it gets adopted by the wider community at some point before I retire. It would be really nice.
We'll talk about that. Fantastic. We'll talk more about that.
Before I die, so that I can see that it's really made an impact. And also the earthquake studies. I would always say that that's my favorite study, was the one that we did after the earthquake, just because it was so real, and we just took this really traumatic, awful event that happened in Christchurch and tried to see whether or not we could again help people become more resilient. And so that's why it's one of my favorite studies, even though there's lots of challenges with it and there's no placebo, and you can argue about whether or not it was just the kindness that we showed towards people. I'm not convinced that was it, and we have lots of reasons why it's not that, but it was just a real life experience that we were then able to make a difference for just under 100 people who went through.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Because I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that study was almost an accidental outcome study.
It was. Well, the first one, so I'll tell your listeners what that whole series of studies was about, because it is a series of different studies that we ended up doing. But it wasn't my plan to ever do any research on earthquakes, of course. Like, why would you start your career thinking, "Oh, that's what I'm going to do?" When I moved to Christchurch, there weren't any earthquakes, so it was certainly wasn't on my radar. So the first one, which is probably not as well known, but is really just a cool opportunity that we had, and that was that on the September 4th earthquake in 2010. That's the really big one that was in Darfield, 7.1, I think it was. That earthquake happened in the middle of the night, and fortunately, there was no fatalities associated with that earthquake, but it was a scary event, and we had ongoing aftershocks that happened after that. But what it allowed me to do is that when it happened, and our house was not badly damaged at all in the 2010 earthquake, very different story in the 2011, but not at all. And the university was closed just so that they could check to make sure that it was safe to enter. I had my very, very first randomized control trial was going, and that was the one with adults with ADHD. It was one of those things of, you know, so many things to try to stop that work from happening. And I'm just like, oh man, and even nature is against me. Like, even nature doesn't want me to do this randomized control trial. So I ended up getting permission to go into the university on the day after the earthquake, to get hold of all of the product so that we could drive around the city and make sure that we kept that randomized controlled trial going.
Wow.
I know I can still remember my bookcase had fallen in front of the door, and so we had to like yank it back. I had the head of department came and helped me out, and we managed to get the things that we needed, and we went driving around. And so in that process I was like, there must be some kind of question that we can answer from this. This is what an opportunity. I'd remembered reading about a study that had been done in earthquake in San Francisco. So I was like,
Ah.
they evaluated the impact of the earthquake on a pain management program for arthritis. And as a graduate student, I remember thinking, that's so cool. Like that, how novel and interesting. And so that's exactly what I thought of, was that we can look at the impact that the micronutrients have on people's resilience to this stress. And so we quickly got ethics approval, and we contacted everyone that we knew who had been in a study of ours, and we phoned them up a week after, 2 weeks after, 3 weeks after, and to see how they were going. And we did a very basic measure of depression, anxiety, and stress. It's the DAS scale. It's very well known. And we did these measures, and we were able to essentially, the group naturally divided into those who had not yet started in one of our trials, or they had been going for at least, I think we had some kind of you had to be on the nutrients for a month or something, or so they'd been on the nutrients. And so we had this natural split of some people who were taking the nutrients at the time of the earthquake and some people who weren't, and it was about half and half. And so we were able to show that, well, yes, earthquakes are stressful. So in week one, anxiety for everybody was really high, but the group of people who were taking the micronutrients recovered far more quickly. And that was like a really cool observation, that if you are well nourished before a stressful event happens, then you're more likely to recover quickly. And so it was just I love that study, and the implications of it are that we need to make sure that we are well nourished all the time, because you never know when a stressor is going to come along. And so we published that actually quite easily, and then moved on. And I thought, well, that's it. That's all my earthquake. And then we had the earthquake in February 22nd, 2011, which was obviously far more damaging, far more devastating. People died, much greater implications on the health in Christchurch, and the mental health of people in Christchurch. And so we designed a randomized control trial. We didn't use a placebo because that's completely unethical to do in that kind of situation. But we had different doses, and we had a comparator that had been compared to placebo. That was Baraka. And so that allowed us to kind of say, if we see an effect, it's good that, we can have confidence that it is a true effect because Baraka has already been shown to be better than placebo. So, and I've seen that done in medication trials before. So it's not a unreasonable approach to take under those circumstances. And so we found that, and we also had a group of people who were willing to be followed. They weren't randomized, but they were willing to be followed and act as a comparison group. So basically, they were people who didn't want to take the nutrients and they wanted to go for conventional treatment. Some of them didn't want to do anything at all, and they just didn't want to swallow the pills, whatever. But they were willing to be monitored over that a fairly short period of time. That study was only 4 weeks long. It happened as there were earthquakes happening all the time. So this was an incredibly stressful event. People's houses were incredibly damaged. There was the zoning that was happening where some people were learning that they could never go back into their home again. So I just want to give the context that it's not a one event. It was an ongoing stressor that kept going all the way through the data collection. But we found that those who had been taking nutrients, didn't actually matter the dose or the type, they did really well relative to that control group. The control group, in terms of their PTSD symptoms, pretty much stayed the same, whereas it dropped, I'm trying to remember, it's like 65% down to 19%. In the group, when we collectively looked at the ones who were taking nutrients. So it was a pretty incredible response and quick response for just taking nutrients. So it just shows you how important these nutrients are for overall brain functioning, helping people recover from really stressful events and also to cope with ongoing stressful events. And so it was just a really neat little study that we did. And again, so proud of having done it because I have an amazing team of students who were willing to go into portacoms, meet with all these people because the university was closed throughout the duration of this study. We were operating outside of a house that I was renting with my family. It was like we were sleeping it in the day, sleeping it in at night, and in the day it was like a hive of activity. We were teaching, we were running clinical psychology, teaching from there, we were running research. It was a really interesting time. So, sorry, I have a...
No, that's all right. So, I mean, for me, even just hearing this, I just think it's so fascinating because I'll often say to people, if you're going under a significant amount of stress, if you're under a significant amount of stress, if there's lots of stuff happening in your life, go on, take some good quality multivitamins, micronutrients, because, there's a good chance that will help your resilience and help you recover a little bit more. So I think that's a nice takeaway. Takeaway, if you're under lots of stress, this is what you could try. It might help you improve.
Absolutely. And we've replicated that finding following a flood that happened in 2013 in Alberta, Canada. We had a slightly different comparator in that one. We had a randomized group. There was a group that was vitamin D only, and they did not do as well as the B vitamin complex that we used and also the broad spectrum micronutrient supplement that we used. So there was replication. And then following the mosque shooting that happened in Christchurch in 2019, we replicated again, but it wasn't a research study per se. I always make that really clear because we had so much research. It's one of those, this is a sort of to me, this is always makes me sad and it always makes me quite emotional talking about it because that event happened. I'm a white woman, it's not the place for me to go into a community and do research on them. It's simply not appropriate. So I took the approach that instead, let's apply the research we already know and see if we can help this community. And every single way we tried to help them, they were really keen to be helped. They were interested in the micronutrients. It was a consistent sort of with their philosophy on life. They liked that better than taking medications or that concept. So, and every door was closed. Every single door was closed. The health system refused to fund them. They were happy to fund therapy by translation, which is not evidence-based. I mean, it's not to say that it's not helpful, but there wasn't research. But they claimed that the reason why they weren't going to fund it was because it wasn't evidence-based. And you're like, how many more randomized controlled trials? I mean, they're out there on stress and B vitamins. We've got all these other observational studies that we've done, and the two RCTs after a natural disaster, and they still claimed there wasn't sufficient evidence to publicly fund it. And just you just kind of go, what is wrong? What has happened? Because the community wanted it. They didn't want medications. They didn't want the benzodiazepines. So they were saying no to conventional treatment. And yet, for whatever reason, it's like we know better, or we're protecting you from the snake oil salesman or something. I'm not sure what it is that they think they're doing, but I'm actually come to the conclusion that sometimes I think they've lost sight of the consumer. And I also feel that in the most recent experiences with MedSafe, but that there's a loss of sight of who's at the center of all of this. And at the end of the day, it's the consumer, and we should be listening to what they want. But that didn't happen. And so in the end, what we did was we fundraised, and we got the nutrients, and we gave them away to anybody who asked for them from that community. And so and then we monitored them as you would, because if you were, let's say, giving out, doing psychotherapy, the typical thing would be to monitor, is this working? Is it working? Yeah. And if it's not working, let's stop this or try something different. So we took that same approach, that it was clinically appropriate to be monitoring them, find out if there was any side effects or anything like that. So we did that, and we did it all online. And we had people from within the Muslim community who were the ones who were going out and reaching out to people and providing the nutrients and the information that they needed. Yeah. So it wasn't me. I wasn't the one who was having contact. There was a wonderful graduate student who was Muslim and was well connected, and he really took a lot of the sort of being that frontline person, and it just was also people going from door, the women whose husbands had been killed in the mosque. They have a certain period of mourning, so they stay at home. And so there were these other women who would go from door to door and then bringing the nutrients. So it was really cool, sort of, I don't know if you call it underground, but this just this movement and the sharing of these nutrients are helping people. And so it just sort of snowballed from there, and we just monitored them. And so we found that they got better. I mean, not everyone gets better, but a lot of them did. And a lot of them really appreciated the opportunity to do something that could help them sort of become a little bit more resilient to what was just a absolutely dire, horrific situation and event that happened. So that's our kind of series of studies that we've done in that space. So it's a really robust story when you hear the whole thing and you go, oh wow, they just kept replicating it. And I don't think we need more evidence to show that nutrients are good for supporting stress. And if there's ever any kind of major big event, we'll never be able to do a placebo-controlled trial. So
absolutely.
As scientists, we just have to accept that this is actually just a different way of monitoring efficacy. Doesn't always have to be placebo-controlled.
Yeah. Thank you for that. That's an amazing story, and it's always so difficult because I always feel a little bit like what did you call us? A snake oil as well, when I say, for goodness sakes, just go and get some micronutrients, because people are like, oh, what are they going to do? And I'm like, well, they research this. Anyway, so it's so hard to be that person, but also to be very aware of the evidence behind it. And well, actually there is quite a bit of research around this now. We need to be using it, but because it's not accepted at this stage by mainstream psychiatry, we're still a little bit on the outliers. We're still the outliers. We're doing some work to make that change. I've got a stirring motion going on for people that are listening. The other thing that one of the other studies, before we get on to the perinatal study, was around, which I found fascinating, was around PMS. And that was one of your students, I think, that
Yeah,
did that study.
Hannah,
And the
Vitalik
reason,
Brown.
yes, the reason why I was so interested in that is because so many women struggle, and then so many women go to their GPs and get offered either a contraceptive pill or an antidepressant
Mm.
or an anxiolytic.
Mm.
And I get a little bit frustrated around all that. So, do you know enough about
Yeah,
that study to speak about
of
that
course.
study?
I know all of these studies. I can hopefully, I mean, we've done so many, but that one, that was B6. We used an active control in that one, and that was B6. So there was no placebo in that one. And the rationale behind that was that we'd never done in my lab a comparison of the micronutrients to an active treatment. So I guess we thought we'd try that design rather than doing a placebo. And then that meant everyone got some kind of a treatment, and we wanted to see whether or not there was any difference. B6 has already been shown, like on its own. High doses of B6 have been shown to be effective on helping people with PMS. So it was going to be a hard bar to get over and see if the multi-nutrients could be even better than that. I can't remember the exact details of how many got better, but I know it was quite a high percentage of them got better in both groups. Quality of life reports in the micronutrient, the broad spectrum group, were higher. The change in quality of life was greater in that group relative to the B6 group. But otherwise, there was just wonderful changes in both groups. There was a signal that if you had like severe PMS, so that would be the oh gosh, what do we call it?
PMDD,
PMDD, that's
premenstrual.
it.
Yep, yep.
Premenstrual dysphoric disorder.
Mm,
There was a signal that you did better if you were on the micronutrients, but that group of people who actually met full criteria was quite small, and so then
mm,
you have lesser. It's much harder to detect an effect, even though it looked like there was probably something going on there. So it
yeah.
would be nice to carry to follow that up, but it's really hard to get that kind of sample because it takes so long. You have to screen a lot of women before you get that full-blown disorder.
Yeah,
You just
I
can't do that in
understand.
a sort of a 2 to 3 year period, to be honest. And maybe we could do it now that we've gone more national, but it's still really tricky. You have to screen a lot of people. Um,
Mm.
so that is it's overall a really good news story. Either B6, which for some people they found that was amazing, or the broad spectrum will also help. And it's something that we've heard over and over again from participants, and this was the reason why we did the study, was that we were hearing the women who were going through our studies telling us that their PMS was getting better. And so
Mm.
oftentimes, I listen to these anecdotal stories, and then I get approached by a lot of students who are looking for projects, and that's what led to that particular study. I said to Hannah, I wanted to do a controlled trial in my lab, and I was like, well, I've heard this from some of the women. They say their PMS is getting better. Are you interested in studying that? And so she was really keen to jump on that and run with it, and that's what led to that study.
Fantastic. And I have seen that myself clinically, and I'm sure we can use names, but actually, even
Mhm.
with B Pure supplements, I've had
Mhm.
women come in with significant
Mhm.
PMS, probably almost would meet the criteria for PMDD, and go on micronutrients. And then, within 3 months, the third cycle, I literally get a phone call saying, I didn't even know I was getting my period.
Right.
I'm a
And that's
different
how it should
woman.
be. Yeah, I know, and that's how it should be. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was
Mhm.
stunning, and I just think that once again, she came because her GP wanted to put her on antidepressants and a few other
Mhm.
things. I want to do
Mhm.
something different. So
I think
great.
I think the story though is that given the research now, that given that our side effect profile is always so minimal, gastrointestinal things I think they're starting to emerge. As if you were to do a meta-analysis, we would probably see a group difference. They're always kind of trending. Um, our latest one, I think we're going to see that's a significant group difference because the study sample was much larger. Um, but it's not something that stays. Like, it's something that people adjust to over a couple of weeks, but that would probably be the only one that I would say is a significant one. Um, But at the same time, we don't have a lot of people drop out of our studies because of that, but it's also kind of highlighting that they probably have some gut issues to start with before they went on
Well,
the
that's what
micronutrient.
I was just going to say. They possibly have some gut issues, and that initial few weeks of being on a micronutrient may actually be, in a strange way, sorting out or, helping the gut, but it's actually causing more issues in the interim.
Yeah, yes. So it's worth warning because I've kind of been looking at some data just even this morning, and it's around 20% of our participants. So there's a good chance that it can happen to some people, and so it's definitely worthwhile informing them that that's a possibility. But I mean, our recommendations are just go slow on upping the dose of the micronutrients. That's usually enough. Drink lots of water. Make sure you take it with food, and that usually just sort of settles. Or take a probiotic. That's another thing that we've been recommending more recently, is just give a probiotic a go, and that also seems to really help. So yeah.
Yeah. And this is the thing, isn't it? We're all individuals, we're all different, and we're trying to do rigorous science on humans who, there is nothing normal about anybody. Everybody's got their own microbiome, everybody's got their own symptoms. And so it's all very well to say, well, we want this as an outcome. But, and I think we'll get to that too, is that sometimes our outcome measures don't actually capture what the person experiences in their change, which I think is so interesting.
This is a very difficult area to study, is psychology and psychiatric symptoms. It's incredibly difficult. Yeah, I wish I had a simple solution. I wish I had a blood test. I wish it wasn't so complicated, but it is.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'm just going to give a little take-home number 2, which is that if people out there are experiencing severe PMS, you might want to try a high-dose micronutrient and see how you feel. And we'll talk about the micronutrients too, because obviously it's going to be part of the...
Exactly, and what I was saying before was, or I don't quite think I finished the sentence, was that if you are that you might as well give this a go first, because the side effect profile is relatively minor compared to some of the side effects associated with the antidepressants or other treatment approaches, and they usually fairly short-lived. So that it's just it seems like that profile is so much better. And if it doesn't work, then there's always medications.
Yeah, totally.
Or the contraceptive pill or whatever.
Yeah, absolutely. Should we touch a little bit on ADHD studies? Because I know that, there's a lot of interest on ADHD.
There is a lot of interest. Yeah.
Yeah, did you see the documentary on Monday night about...
No, I did not. I mean, I saw that it was airing. Is it worth watching? Is it?
I found it really interesting. There's a lot there that I wasn't aware of. So, I found it really interesting. Okay. Of course, nutrients weren't mentioned at all as part, nor was diet. But we'll get around that. Can you tell me a little bit about some of the studies that you've done on ADHD? What the outcomes have been broadly?
Sure. Yeah, broadly. So, all of my research started with ADHD, and the reason for that is that that's what I did my PhD on, women with ADHD, and then I followed that up as a postdoc and was interested in adult ADHD as it presented in teenagers. And then when I moved to New Zealand, I did another study on I'm trying to remember another study on teenagers with ADHD. So it was something that I was very familiar with. And so when I finally decided to study the micronutrients that Bonnie Kaplan had been, encouraging me to study for years and years and years, it made sense to study adults with ADHD because at the time when we started the research, which was in 2007, 2008, adult ADHD was not accepted in New Zealand as being a legitimate diagnosis. I think there was still the belief that you grew out of it when you turned 18. And so there were all these people who were going through our studies where we were just interested in different things of, some of the challenges they had, like executive function or self-esteem, or just trying to document some of their difficulties, that we thought, well, why don't we try the micronutrients with this group? One of the things, a feature that is very prominent in ADHD, though it's not part of the diagnosis per se, is emotional dysregulation. So we see that a lot. We've documented that a lot. And that was the emotional dysregulation is the first observation that was made with the micronutrients way back when the micronutrients were first tried with people with bipolar disorder. So it seemed like that helping people with those emotions was the sort of where you really did see the changes occurring. So it made sense to give it a go. So you just sort of understand the background. No expectation of it having the micronutrients having a specific effect on ADHD, although, you know, that's why you do the science, that's why you do the research. So the first study we did was an open label trial. That's just where you take about 15 people and you just see whether or not, can I get these people who are forgetful, inattentive, able to, and you know, could be disorganized, all these things that are characteristic features of ADHD. Can we get them to sort of stick with the regime, which at that point was 15 pills a day? So that was the sort of what we wanted to know at the beginning. That's why we started with a small sample. You don't start with a really big randomized controlled trial if you can't get people to follow it. And we were pleasantly surprised that we could get people to follow the regime. We always give them, I don't have one on my desk anymore, but it's just a pill container, you know, 3 little, you know, that you have little.
Yep. What nanas have, yes.
Yeah, that's exactly. So we gave every participant one of those, and that really helped. And we even set up text messages 3 times a day to remind them. So we really did everything we could to encourage and ensure that they were able to follow the instructions to take these pills 3 times a day. And so super successful. Our compliance rate was really high. Our adherence was really good. So, and we didn't have any dropouts, so that's also good. That meant that there were no significant side effects that occurred that meant people would drop out of the study. And I think it was like 80% of, there was 80% response rate in that sample. So it was higher than what we've seen in our randomized control trials. That's not surprising. That's what happens. Randomized control trials, you tend to see a drop in your efficacy because people don't know what they're taking, and that influences their responses. So just to understand that sort of standard observation. But so we had this really great response rate, and we saw benefits in the ADHD symptoms, and we saw benefits in the emotional dysregulation. So we followed that up with a randomized control trials with adults with ADHD. And in that study, we showed the self-report symptoms showed benefit in the ADHD symptoms, superiority of the micronutrients over the placebo. I'm trying to remember what other findings we had. There was one of the clinician ones also in the ADHD space. I'm pretty sure it was significant. Not everything was significant, but overall, there were identified and consistent findings across the board that whenever there was a significant effect, it was favoring the micronutrients over the placebo. We had 47% of them identified as much to very much improved, and it was 21% in the placebo group. So it was a really good outcome, and it took forever to publish because couldn't get it through the gate in a lot of cases. A lot of journals weren't interested in the study. They couldn't understand the concept of giving a broad spectrum of micronutrients. They wanted us to justify every single one of them.
Like as an individual. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. There was a lot. We haven't had quite that level of craziness, but it has been really, it was everything was wrong with it. And you're just like, but we ran it like a drug study. Like it just didn't make sense why we're having so much trouble with publishing it. But there you go. That's the sort of the story. And it really opened my eyes to the fact that some people don't want these results out there. There's a lot of barriers to getting this information out there in decent publications, because that's always been the goal for us, is to get these results published in really good journals, because that's the first reason why you might dismiss something is, oh, well, it was published in an alternative journal, and so therefore we're not going to pay attention to it. So I've invested an enormous, in times where I'm like, can I just give up and publish it somewhere else? No. always kept going, even if
Incredible.
even if it was, sometimes I've appealed decisions made by editors, I think at least 3 or 4 times so far. So that means you go back to the editor and you challenge the decision that they've made.
Mm,
And I've had them overturned. I
mm.
think in at least 3 cases, I've had the decision overturned where you point out that they've been biased
Wow,
in their
that's
decision
amazing.
making. Yeah.
That is
But
amazing.
it's hard work. Like it's a lot of writing. It's a lot of having to continuously defend something that I don't even feel like I should be having to defend, because all I'm doing is presenting the data. I'm not there to find a good result. That's not that. I'm there to say this is what we did and these are the findings, and you should therefore publish them because that's what we do in science. And instead you're having to defend it when I don't think that really should be my role to defend it. It
It's so curious, isn't it? Because it does make you wonder, what is the pushback? Like, what is the cause for them to be rejecting,
yeah,
so to speak,
yeah,
this
correct. Yeah.
science?
Um I, yeah, what is it? We're all biased.
Mm,
In whatever way. It's hard. You can't be human and not be biased in some way.
mm,
So if we accept that inherent bias exists, then if you've been trained in a certain way of thinking about the world, and that you've been trained that there's only one way to treat mental health problems, and that is through the medical model lens, then anything that challenges that medical model is going to be rejected without thought. So that, I think, happens a lot. And people
mm,
don't even know that they're doing that, but they've been taught that nutrition is irrelevant. I was taught that nutrition was irrelevant to the brain when I went through clinical psychology training. So it's standard message in nursing. I'm sure is this may
it's
probably
the same.
similar.
Yeah.
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 So
I mean, it was a long time ago though that I trained. I just were curious. The people that were part of that ADHD study or the studies, have they continued on the micronutrients? What's
uh,
happened to them in the future? Do you know?
yeah, some of them, oh, absolutely, some of them have, and some of them have come out of the woodworks since this whole um, banning or whatever it is that MedSafe has done, or it's not exactly a ban, but it's making it more and more difficult. So I've heard from quite a few of them, and
Interesting.
who have been taking it. So now for some of them, it's been 15 years, and they were
Wow.
just, just kind of like hit out of the blue of like, what? My nutrients are getting taken away from me. I've been taking these for 15 years, buying them in New Zealand for 15 years, and having to fight for them, and going to their GPs and trying to get them prescribed, and that not happening, and the challenge, the problems associated with that. I mean, it's just endless
Yeah.
problems. So yes, there are some who are still taking them and really benefiting from them. So my experience is that if you do well, you'll probably continue to do well unless something comes along that might disturb that. And so
Mm,
that could be a major stressor.
mm.
And then it might mean you need more to support your brain because the nutrients get diverted to the fight flight response, or you get sick.
Yeah.
We certainly have heard that when people get unwell, that they're not as the nutrients don't seem to support their mental health as well.
Mm.
So we've things like that. Dental work seems something about the
Oh,
anesthesia or
interesting.
something.
Right.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's something there that can happen. So we just kind of warn people. A growth spurt with our kids. Um,
Ah,
we'll hear the nutrients aren't working as well. It's happening. Like, have they grown suddenly? Like, oh yeah, they just grew like 2 inches or something.
incredible, isn't it?
Yes, and
Yeah.
but then it makes sense because the nutrients are not specific to the brain, and so they're helping the whole body wherever it needs. And so it
Mm,
totally makes sense that the nutrients are redirected to support immediate need.
mm.
And if it's growth,
Nice.
then that's what it is. So it
Yeah.
goes to that, and then there's less available for the brain. Totally makes sense to me when you think about the role that nutrition plays in our health and
Yeah.
development. So have a baby, then pregnancy,
That's
or at the other end of life as well. As we age, our ability to use nutrients becomes less efficient, and we're not as good at it. So you might need more nutrients as you age. So
mm,
there's, so there are. It's usually a logical reason if the nutrients stop working.
mm.
Uh, we can usually find it. oftentimes, unfortunately, sometimes people will go, oh, they're just not working anymore, and they stop them. And I've certainly heard that story. But if they get in touch with me and say it's not working, then I can usually work through and see if we can find out what's happened.
Okay, that's really interesting to know. So, and I just want to put this out there for the listeners because they might have children who have ADHD. Can you just briefly, and I'm sure that we can discuss the safety of these nutrients, because
Sure.
if you can just clarify around that, especially for children, obviously.
Yes, yeah. I mean, we cannot, I've already discussed the side effects are typically minimal. And we do see the gastrointestinal issues though coming with the kids as well. But we haven't had serious adverse events that we can attribute to the nutrients. So that means that we have had some serious adverse events in our trials over the last 15 years. But they're always medically monitored, and the medical professional on our team will make a decision about whether or not that adverse event was due or likely due to the micronutrients or not. And none of the serious ones that have happened have ever been believed to be due to the micronutrients. Like someone broke a leg and ends up in hospital is a serious adverse event. We don't think that the micronutrients caused that. Make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That makes complete sense.
I don't want to give the impression that we've never had a serious adverse event. But they're always described in every one of our studies if they happen. And so then you can look at them and go, oh, those are just things that happened, and they happen to happen during an RCT.
Right. Okay. One more question about the ADHD studies.
Yeah.
What do people themselves report? Like, is there a common thread that you notice that people themselves report when they take the micronutrients? Is there a usual, like, I feel calmer, or I'm focused, or is it a mix of all sorts of outcomes?
I think it's a mix of things, but some of the common ones would be sort of that the fog lifts. I've heard that a lot.
Right.
The calming of the mind, being able to hold on to ideas rather than them escaping and running away. The regulation of mood, just feeling more stable, is one that we hear a lot from people, is that stability of mood and resilience. Did you want me to just sort of say quickly about the ADHD studies, just that we showed the same thing as we saw with the adults? The micronutrients outperformed the placebo. It's probably not, if you're looking for something in the short term to be helpful for ADHD, it is not going to be as efficacious as stimulants, but the side effect profile is much kinder. The kids grow rather than their growth getting stunted. One of the studies, the replication that was done in the States, showed that they grew 6 millimeters more in the 8-week period that they were monitoring the kids on the micronutrients compared to placebo. So
in 8 weeks.
Yes, I know. It was really stunning. The infants, sort of along that same line, were 2 centimeters longer when they were exposed to the micronutrients in pregnancy compared to standard care, which is antidepressants. So it's like, wow, they're longer. These kids are going to grow and be a lot taller, which is, I think, overall a good thing. So, but long term, just in terms of safety, because you were asking me about that and whether or not people are kind of hesitant. I mean, we followed up to 1 year. We did do a publication that looked at people like up to 10 years after. It was a fairly small sample, so you're not necessarily going to be able to detect those rare events that can happen. So I cannot guarantee there isn't some kind of a rare thing that may happen to someone taking the micronutrients. Some obvious things to consider is whether or not they have hemochromatosis or they have some rare genetic difference like Wilson's disease. That means that you can't metabolize copper. So these known metabolic inborn errors of metabolism are important to know about, because they could influence your reaction to the micronutrients. But outside of that, there isn't any reason for us to think that something adverse might happen. It would be absolutely reasonable to have a regular checkup, blood work done, make sure that there's no adverse effects on liver function, kidney function, so your standard
Mm.
protocol.
Mm. And from what I hear, what I'm thinking is that compared to some of the medications that are prescribed,
Yes,
the risks are
they are
a
lower.
lot lower.
Oh, we're
Okay.
not, we have been assessing those risks associated with antidepressants in all of our clinical trials, and we are just not getting that same level of problems that are identified with antidepressants. So, you can say that like we're not treating people who are well. And that's really an
Yeah.
important thing to always point out is that these are people who are really struggling. They are impaired and they get well. And so you've got to make that decision of, do I want to stay well with the very small risk that this might be harming me, but I don't know what that is, versus being unwell or taking a medication that has got known long-term effects, particularly potentially metabolic effects that can influence your weight, increase the likelihood of type 2 diabetes. We don't see that with the
Mm.
micronutrients.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. The Nutrimum study.
Yes.
Tell
Yep.
us a little bit about that and some of the outcomes that
Sure.
you've discovered around this study, because I
Yeah.
do think that this study is amazing, and yeah.
I think so too. It's a world first. It's a randomized controlled trial, placebo controlled, that's done during pregnancy. Now, just understand that there's never been a placebo controlled trial done with antidepressants in pregnancy. I think there's a reason for that. I've thought a lot about this of why did that happen? And the answer came to me when I was at a conference recently it was an obstetric and gynecology conference where I was presenting some of those data. But there was another presentation that was on Ozempic. And Ozempic is the weight loss drug, right?
Yeah.
And my understanding with Ozempic is that you need to continue to take it. You can't stop that medication because if you stop, then your weight is going to return. So you need to stay on that medication. And so they're now dealing with the problem of what do we do when people get pregnant? What
Mm.
are the risks? And they don't know what the risks are. So they are in the prescribers are in this very difficult position of having to make those decisions of, do I keep the mother on this Ozempic because we don't know the impact it's going to have on the infant, or do I take her off when I know that's going to have an influence and impact on her metabolic function? So I they're going ahead and monitoring those women during pregnancy to see whether or not it's going to have any impact. And there will be observational studies that will come out in the next few years on the effect of Ozempic on the infant. So I think the same thing happened with all these medications, is that the antidepressants came along, people were using it, then they got pregnant, and so then the question was, do I keep this mother on the antidepressant or do I take her off? And so they had no data to inform those decisions. So they came to the conclusion that it was better to make sure that mother's depression was treated. And so therefore they kept them on. That's my understanding of why the control trials never happened. The observational studies have shown that there is this potential risk. It is highly debated. Some will say there is no risk. The way I'm interpreting it is that it does not remove the risks that are associated with untreated depression on birth outcomes. That's my interpretation of data, if you
Right.
want to be kind about it. So while you could argue that antidepressants don't cause any negative outcomes, they are not removing the negative outcomes associated with depression. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. And I'm also curious to know if studies were done, whether they were actually published as well, because if it was
I
a
haven't
very
found
negative
them.
outcome, yeah.
Yeah, I haven't found them. So we can't say, I mean, this is what's been so interesting about doing Nutrimum for me, is that I've never done a study in maternal health. And along came a graduate student who really wanted, we discussed it and thought, well, if you really want to do a study that's going to change the world, then we need to do it um, in people who are pregnant. So that's what launched Nutrimum, was to say this is where it has to happen if you really want to have an impact. So and then I learned about that there were no studies on antidepressants, and I kept looking and looking and asking and stuff. So we don't even know if they work. Like, we don't even know if they actually treat depression. Our data suggests that it's not as good as micronutrients, but it's hard to do because we haven't done a proper placebo like comparison of the two, nor do I think that will ever happen. So I just wanted to give that context because um, that I wanted to sort of explain what I think is going on around why those trials never were done and why they won't happen now, because there's no benefit to the pharmaceutical industry to do a randomized controlled trial in pregnancy, because the observational studies suggest that some adverse events may be revealed. Yeah. So, yeah. So anyway, so going to the positive side of this is that we thought we'd try the micronutrients. I mean, the bottom line here, Helen, is that there are a lot of women, about 80% based on research, who stop their antidepressants in pregnancy. And so that is the reality. You can try to convince them that the antidepressants are safe relative to the risk of their depression, but women are making that decision. I don't want to take it, regardless of what you say. I don't want to risk the impact on my infant. So they are voting that way. So we need to respect that based on informed consent, that that's the decisions that they're making. And so therefore, we owe it to them to look at what other treatment options might be worthwhile having a positive impact on their depression. And so that's where the micronutrients come in. So we studied the micronutrients. We got ethical approval. It was approved by MedSafe as well. Remarkably, they were very happy for us to do this work, or not unhappy. I don't know if MedSafe are ever happy. So, and we ran the trial. It was a 12-week trial. It was very hard to recruit. And so this is an important point to make about this study that you may not appreciate, is that early on we realized that people, the midwives, the obstetricians, even the moms themselves were really cautious and worried about taking the micronutrients during pregnancy. And that's probably partially driven by fear that we put in women about anything at all that they ingest during pregnancy, but also that there's been these various things like vitamin A and worries about vitamin A at a certain dose, and that, that caused them to kind of probably almost reject the idea of taking nutrients. I'm not sure what's behind it, but there's a lot of caution and fair enough, because while we could look at the single nutrient literature to sort of provide the evidence required to show that there was no reason for us to think this was unsafe, we didn't have the data. So we couldn't we couldn't hand on heart say this is not going to be harmful to your infant. There was no reason for us to think that it was going to be harmful. It's kind of like what I was saying before. There's no risk that's been identified, but we don't know whether or not that's going to happen. So we had to, in informed consent, that's what we said. And yet there were women who agreed to be in it anyway. And so we are forever grateful to those 88 women who took that chance. But what we did, that made me realize early on, was that we had to collect a lot of risk associated outcomes. So more than anything, we were really looking at, are we causing any harm? Because that is so important, to be able to either reassure or not that there was no adverse outcomes. And so in this particular case, the most obvious place to look was birth outcomes and looking at infant outcomes. And so we collected, in order to contextualize our outcomes for those Nutrimum infants, we collected data on what we call a reference group. They were women who did not take the micronutrients that we were giving in the Nutrimum study. They had variability in their depression. Most of them weren't depressed, whereas all our Nutrimum moms started depressed. And we ended up also getting a smaller group. There are 20 of them in this group, who were mums who had chosen to stay on antidepressants. They weren't randomized, but they decided to stay on the antidepressants, and they agreed to be a comparison for us. And that is such that sample is gold because it's standard care. And so it allows us to compare the micronutrients to standard care. And you always want to know whether or not this is going to be any better or worse than standard care. I wasn't prepared for what we found with that group, but it was the most logical group to have to see whether or not there were any harms associated with the micronutrients. So I just wanted you to understand that we collected those data in order to contextualize our outcomes with infants born around the same time in Aotearoa. So that's why we had those other groups. So we have an RCT embedded in an observational study that then ended up is still going on, and those kids are now close to 5 years of age, and so we're monitoring them again.
Wow.
Yeah. So we found that in the RCT was that regardless of which arm you were in, we had 75% of our mothers go into remission based on their self-report of levels of depression. And so there's just sort of standard goalposts that you can use based on the EPDS, which is a common measure, the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale. That we used. And so based on the metrics that are used in the literature, we had a lot of women go into remission, which is a good news story because it says that if you monitor, we've called it light touch therapy, is that if you monitor people and you care for them, of which of course we do in clinical trials, and we look after them, and if we don't hear from them, we call them because we need their data. I mean, we care for them as well, but their data is important to us. Their experiences are important regardless what happens. That in itself is so therapeutic and is such a good news story in itself. But the women who were randomized to the micronutrients self-reported themselves to be more likely to be very much improved if they were randomized to the micronutrients compared to the active placebo. We had an active placebo. It had iodine and it had riboflavin in it. Riboflavin to make sure that the urine changes color if it's going to. It doesn't always happen for everybody. And iodine, because that is the only nutrient that the Ministry of Health recommend women to take after the first trimester. So that's what we had in there. We didn't want to prevent them from being able to take the nutrient that is recommended. So, so that's the first side of it, was that we saw superiority in that overall functioning, and there was also better sleep reported in the micronutrient group compared to the active controls, and then a whole bunch of biomarkers also improved in the micronutrient group. We've published on the microbiome data, which is showing that the diversity of the microbiome got better. Didn't exactly get better. It's interesting. It stayed stable in the micronutrient group and got worse in the placebo. So there's something about what happens in pregnancy where things are depleted and getting worse. Same thing happens with the nutrient levels. We kept them stable in their nutrients, maybe slightly going up, but nothing like I've seen in a non-pregnant population. So vitamin D did go up, but not massively, and vitamin B12 went up, but not the way I've seen it before. So those nutrients were kind of staying stable, and they were depleting and going down in the placebo group. So the micronutrients are holding, and it makes sense because the nutritional needs are so much higher, and so of course the mom is going to be the one that gets depleted. And we're allowing mom to not get depleted, which, you know, is a really important thing because we think that's going to reduce the likelihood of her having postnatal depression, which we've also looked at. We haven't published those data, but they're of course a really good news story there. So we've published on these biological markers. We published on the vitamin C, which showed that we were keeping the vitamin C levels in a decent place. The microbiome just came out about a month ago, and then the birth outcomes. This isn't the order of publication, but it's the order in which things happen. It's the birth outcomes was the hardest ever to publish of any of the papers I've ever been involved in, but it just came out 2 weeks ago. And that showed it's again such a good news story. The micronutrient birth outcomes. So the infants who are exposed to at least 2 months of micronutrients during pregnancy. At this stage, you have to understand the RCT phase is over. We're not dealing with a placebo anymore. The mums were all offered micronutrients after the RCT phase was over. So lots of mums got the micronutrients even if they had been on the active placebo. So just to understand the context. And we looked at the infants who were exposed to at least 2 months of micronutrients in utero, and their birth outcomes are on par with a standard, the reference group. They were pretty much the same, if not better, and better than national averages as well. So for example, premature birth rate in the micronutrient group was 5.5%, and it's 7.9% in the Canterbury region. So it was lower. And remember that depression increases your risk of premature birth. And the rate of premature birth in a sample of mums who have untreated depression is about 15%.
Wow.
So yeah, I know. It's amazing how high it is. And it's something that I think we don't really fully appreciate is the huge impact it has on birth outcomes. And we know that increases the likelihood of all kinds of ongoing health issues. So we really we want to support moms to term. So it's so important. The rate of resuscitation in our group was lower than the reference group and much lower than the standard care group. But I'll talk about that in a second. So all in all good news story, which meant that we mitigated the risks associated with untreated depression on birth outcomes. So that is such a cost-saving story for our government, because if you think about each preterm birth costs us on average $28,000. It starts to really add up quickly when you realize the percentage of mums who are going to have a preterm birth if they're depressed, and that we can avert that with micronutrients. And so if we just paid for the micronutrients in pregnancy for mums who are depressed, I did the calculation on it, and we would save millions, about $10 million per annual cohort.
That's incredible.
If you were to treat every woman who has untreated depression with the micronutrients.
And this is just depression that we're talking about.
Yeah, that's
what
right.
about all the other mental health
Exactly.
issues, or even just a person that is well?
Exactly. Yes.
Significantly that we don't know. But because they're often suggested, aren't they, to have some multivitamins.
Yes.
When they're pregnant, but they're very low dose.
Yeah.
And not very good quality.
Correct. That's right. Yeah. So the opportunity here of saving money is huge. So I wish we could, again, I'm, as you can see, I'm bursting to tell everybody about it, and I have done everything I can to tell everybody about it. But really what I would love is that phone call from the Ministry of Health saying, we've just read about this study, and this is like so exciting.
This is amazing.
This is amazing, and it looks like this would really save us a lot of money. And okay, well, it's only one study, so maybe we should, you could do another. Could you maybe do another, and or maybe do a could we do it in a controlled way within a service and see what happens, and maybe monitor ones who are not on it? Some kind of inspirational phone call like that. I'm just waiting for it to happen.
We'll all wait for that, Julia, because I agree. I mean, I just think New Zealand is a perfect population to study. We've got all these amazing resources, and we have people like you here who are willing. And wouldn't it be amazing that we can be at the forefront of mental health treatment with micronutrients? And we know that micronutrients isn't everything. We haven't even talked about diet, but that's probably for another talk. And the changes that we could make in people's lives. Totally incredible.
Exactly. So, and then just to finish the story, the infants were really well regulated on the micronutrients, better than the reference group, and then better than that standard care antidepressant group. And they were really lagging behind in all of these capabilities. It's that part is sad. It is really sad, but also what has been surprising has been the pushback that I've gotten from the medical professional saying, well, those whatever you're observing has got nothing to do with the antidepressants. Is the untreated depression. You're kind of like, well, if the antidepressants were working, then they wouldn't be depressed. But anyway, that seems to be beside the point. Um, but it is. I've been very clearly told that the antidepressants are safe. So many times in the last few months when I've been presenting this, where I'm presenting it in, at ground rounds at different universities, and people at the end have been saying, you said something around the controversy about antidepressants and their effects on say, for example, premature birth. There is no controversy. It has been very clearly established that they are not causing any problems. And so I kind of go, what literature are you reading?
And if there haven't been studies with, comparison studies, where are you getting this information from?
Well, it's exactly, but it's because they control for depression, and so therefore the effect of the antidepressant is mitigated by that, the way they do it statistically. But at the end of the day, what really they should be going on is going, why aren't the antidepressants leading to better birth outcomes and better infant outcomes if the mother is well treated during pregnancy? Even if it's not the antidepressant causing any kind of harm, we don't even need to go there. All we have to say is, why aren't the risks being lowered? And that's what we saw with the micronutrients. And so the whole story is a really good news story. And I wait.
And it's so important I think throughout hearing you and with some of the work I'm doing, the groundswell will come from the people. And I think this is so important for people to hear this information and to feel empowered enough to have these discussions with their GP, hopefully, and maybe present some of the research. And this is what I would like to do. I've had people come to see me saying, I've got bipolar disorder, I want to start micronutrients. And it's like, well, this is going to be challenging because we need your psychiatrist on board and But when people do and they feel empowered and they actually have huge changes to their mental health, to their well-being, to their lives, it enables them to work, it enables them to function, it enables them to be a good parent.
I do want to say, though, that there are people out there who are prescribers, physicians, who are on board. And there are some really lovely and wonderful people there. So I don't want to paint them all as being in that camp of ignoring some of the evidence or dismissing it or whatever, or being negative about the micronutrients. There are some wonderful people here in Aotearoa who are supportive of this approach. And it is important to really acknowledge them, because I feel like the risks that they are taking are even greater than the risks that I'm taking. Because they are going against the medical establishment and they are speaking, and they're often lone voices. So I just wanted to have a shout out for those amazing individuals.
Fantastic. So we're going to start wrapping this up.
Sure.
One of the things, we've mentioned this a few times, and we'll only briefly touch on this, is that these micronutrients have been sold in New Zealand.
Yeah.
We've had a distributor here in New Zealand. People have been able to buy them. They're expensive, but they've been able to purchase them. And I know that many people will choose to purchase them with their own money without being funded, because it enables them to have a life. It enables them to work. It enables them to function. And they've been doing this for many years. And what's happened in the last few months is that MedSafe, from what I understand, due to the fact that these are therapeutic, these supplements actually work, as shown by the research, MedSafe have actually withdrawn or have instructed that we are no longer able to sell it to the public in New Zealand. Short version.
Well, no, not. It's that it can't be sold as a dietary supplement. I think what makes me a bit grumpy is that they are saying that it's therapeutic. And yes, it is therapeutic at 12 pills a day, but it is not being sold in New Zealand at 12 pills a day. It's being sold in New Zealand at 4 pills a day. It's very similar. That's not dissimilar to the argument that you'd say for vitamin D. Vitamin D is a dietary supplement under 1,000 IUs, and over 1,000 IUs, you need it prescribed. So and that's where the therapeutic benefit of vitamin D comes from, is above 1,000 IUs. So it is being sold as a dietary supplement at 4 pills a day, not 12 pills a day. We are in this very difficult situation, though, where, yes, I absolutely agree, it's got therapeutic purpose at 12 pills a day. It is treating serious psychiatric disorders at 12 pills a day. But there's no avenue in New Zealand for that to become a medicine. There is no good avenue. So if you start to understand the complexity of that side of it, you realize that there's no way that this dietary supplement could be made a medicine here. And I'll just explain a few of those like really challenging issues. One of them is that in order for them to be sold in New Zealand as a medicine, they have to be imported into New Zealand by a medical facility that is got a license to sell a pharmaceutical. And it is currently sold by someone who doesn't have that license. But in order for someone to import it, then it means that it has to be manufactured in the United States in a facility that is pharmaceutical grade. It's a dietary supplement. They have different types of grades, and that's called GMP, and that's what kind of facility it's currently sold in. This is a really small company without the resources to be able to move their manufacturing to a pharmaceutical grade facility because of the quantity of the product that they would need to produce in order to make that financially viable. The price would go up, of course. They also then don't have any guarantee that MedSafe is going to accept it as a medicine, because they have to go through a $50,000 application fee in order for even the product to be considered. So what you realize soon is that it's actually very difficult for a dietary supplement to go down the medicine route unless they've got a very deep pockets and capabilities there. So, and essentially though, New Zealand is a small market, really small market. And so they're imposing a ridiculous barriers to a company that is outside of New Zealand and from importing it into New Zealand. And they don't care. And, I raised this before, was that I'm at the point where I'm going, MedSafe are not here for the consumer. They are not here because if they were about the consumer and making sure that New Zealanders have access to every, products that have been shown to be efficacious, they would be doing everything in their power to make this available in this country. And they are not. Instead, they are creating barriers and they are not changing the legislation in order to make it accessible to New Zealanders. And it's easy change. The regulations can easily be modified in order to make this legal again in New Zealand, and they're not going down that route. So if they're listening, I only request that they see this from a humanitarian perspective.
Yeah.
And see that this is they're causing harm. They're preventing people from getting easy access to the nutrients, but it's also an equity issue because people who do not have the funding cannot get it. And it cannot get funding through the farm funding route until it becomes a medicine. So they've closed the door to it. Yeah. And they're making it incredibly difficult for the access to happen. And it could be so easily changed if they had the will. They, government changed the laws on guns in 4 weeks. They can change a couple of doses of these nutrients to make this a dietary supplement in New Zealand. It's not
totally. So at the moment, people can only get it by prescription. Is that correct?
Prescription, correct. And so they've allowed a workaround while a legal route is found. And so at the moment, it's being still sold by someone who doesn't have a license to sell a pharmaceutical. And they've accepted that is an okay way to go forward, as long as the company is speaking. Yeah, it's a short-term solution. You can still import it with a prescription, but that's super expensive because you can only import 3 months worth. And so then you can see that the cost of the shipping is really quite high. You can't like bulk order it because you're not allowed to bulk order something that is identified as a medicine. And then just the final barrier is that they've called it an unapproved medicine, which means you can't advertise it. So no one's allowed to advertise.
Oh, okay. All right. But a person can go to their GP, can be experiencing
Yes,
depression,
they can,
perhaps,
and they
and
can get a script.
request
Yes, and they can go
a
and get it
script,
for the non-lithium version of the
but
product.
only the non-lithium version.
Yeah. Yeah, the lithium one that one's just at the moment a no-go zone. Again, a very simple solution to that one. Um, but any dose at the moment, any dose of lithium is considered a medicine, even though there's no evidence of the small amount of lithium having any therapeutic benefit for the treatment of disease. They've still declared it to be a medicine, which again is something that they could so easily change. So I think there are some really simple solutions. It doesn't require a new regulation, like a new act. You can change some of the regulations. And the whole reason for having regulations that is that they're supposed to be easily changed. So,
and I find it fascinating, like if they stop selling those micronutrients, who's to say, what about other micronutrients? What about other
exactly.
multivitamins?
Well, exactly. And
Are they going to stop those as well? Not be able to buy them?
well, that's the thing is that, and this is another worry that I have, is that if, let's say, for example, they did get the nutrients approved as a medicine, what is to stop them from saying, okay, the amount of B2 in this product that has been identified as a medicine can now no longer be used in a dietary supplement. There is nothing to stop MedSafe applying that kind of logic, which is the logic they've applied with lithium. So what is to stop them from applying that and then making dietary supplements less accessible? And I'm not here to make dietary supplements less accessible. So I've got this quandary of, do you push the medicine route, or do you hope that at some point some reason can be placed upon this problem, and a simpler solution is found than the one that they are suggesting.
Whew.
Yeah.
It's a lot,
So,
eh?
yeah, it is.
Fantastic. Thank you, Julia.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I hope that's useful to all the listeners out there to get a bit of a sense of where this whole
it is so useful, and I want to thank you for the research that you've done in this area. And I have to say that it's been 10 years since you did your TEDx talk.
It is, yeah. Yeah.
And so I was there in Christchurch on that day.
Mm-hmm.
And it was one of the moments in my career that I thought, it was one of the mouth-dropping moments. I was like, what the heck? Why aren't we doing this in psychiatry? Why aren't we looking at this? Why aren't we embracing this? So I've been following your work now for 10 years.
You're great.
Championing.
Thank you. And I need that. And I think you recognize that, Helen, is that sometimes I just don't have any, my tank is empty. There's only so much I as an individual can do. And I do need other people like yourself to also be pushing this, because there's only so far that I can go. And there's also a point where it's no longer appropriate for me to be doing some of the advocating. I do it because I do it for the people who we've helped, but it can often look like I'm working for the company, which I don't. I don't get any money from them, but it can often be the perception could be that that's what's happening here, and it's not. It's never at the heart of why I do what I do. What's at the heart of why I do what I do is to help people who have mental health challenges. That's why I went into this work. But unfortunately, it can be viewed differently. So I have to always be dancing that sort of fine line between doing the research and the advocating. But and so more recently, I've ended up doing a lot of advocating. But I really wish I wasn't. I didn't have to do so much of that.
Yeah, I hear you. Thank you so very, very much. And gosh, get some rest over the Christmas period. Take some time off, and appreciate your time today and all your knowledge as well.
Thank you, Helen.